What if the most terrifying weapon in a royal court was not a sword, an army, or a crown, but a woman who could kill without ever touching her victims? The night the Lady of Poison revealed her true nature, the palace felt something shift, something so profound that even kings who believed they feared nothing found their hands trembling under the table. Witnesses later said the air itself seemed to thicken, as if the walls were listening, waiting, recording the first moment in history when the court realized it had welcomed a silent executioner disguised as an advisor. No one knew her real name. They only knew the way she walked, how her presence altered conversations, how whispers died the moment she entered a room. Some claimed she had studied in monasteries that no longer existed. Others swore she had once been part of a forbidden order of herbalists banished from the continent. But what unsettled the most powerful figures was that she never seemed interested in power for its own sake. She studied people the way alchemists studied metals, watching their expressions, their fears, the small fractures in their confidence. And she remembered everything. On the night of the Grand Council feast, she did not sit among the nobles. She moved between them, silent, observing, letting tension ferment. A queen from the Northern Isles described feeling a cold pressure on her chest every time the lady passed behind her chair. A foreign prince recorded in his private journal that he had never seen a woman carry stillness like a blade, sharp enough to cut without being drawn. But none of them understood that she had been preparing this moment for months, testing reactions, choosing targets, mapping influence like a general planning a siege. Then came the first shift. A duke collapsed mid-toast, his face drained of life in seconds. Panic spread, but the lady remained calm, almost expectant, as if she were watching a play she had written. Within minutes, a second noble fell. A third began gasping for air. Yet no one smelled poison, no one saw contamination, no one understood how these deaths were happening. And that was the moment when fear became something physical, something that tightened throats and froze voices. The lady watched them fight for breath, not out of pleasure, but out of calculation, measuring exactly how long it took before the strongest rulers in the realm lost their composure. The court never learned which toxins she had used that night. Some believed she carried powders finer than dust, dispersed with a flick of her sleeve. Others claimed she had mastered venom extracted from creatures known only to remote tribes. But the truth was far more disturbing. Her poisons did not simply kill. They sent a message, a demonstration that influence in the royal court no longer belonged to those with armies, wealth, or heritage. It belonged to the one person who understood how to dismantle power from the inside, one pulse, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. If you have ever wondered how a single presence could bend an entire kingdom into silence, tell me your impressions in the comments and let me know what part of this intrigues you most. Your like and your subscription help keep stories like this alive, reminding us why understanding these moments matters. And as we continue, what comes next will reveal why this single night changed the fate of every monarch who witnessed it, shaping a fear that would echo far beyond the walls of that cursed court. But the most unsettling part was that the Lady of Poison did not flee after the nobles collapsed. Instead, she drifted deeper into the palace corridors, as though the chaos behind her was simply the natural consequence of a plan she had long rehearsed. The guards, unsure whether they were dealing with an assassin, a sorceress, or something far more calculated, hesitated to approach her. They claimed later that she carried an atmosphere with her, a silent warning, that touching her would mean touching death itself. What no one in the royal court realized was that she had been studying them long before that fatal night. Her power came not only from rare toxins, but from a talent far more dangerous: the ability to read human weakness with unbearable precision. She observed rivalries disguised as alliances, wounds disguised as pride, and ambitions disguised as loyalty. She understood which kings feared losing their crowns, which queens felt threatened by younger successors, which advisors were desperate for relevance. She mapped these insecurities like a strategist preparing a war, each vulnerability becoming a possible entry point. Her infiltration of the court had begun subtly. She offered remedies for sleeplessness to queens haunted by political anxiety, antidotes to princes terrified of being poisoned by rivals, and exotic tonics to aging monarchs desperate to maintain strength. None of them questioned where her knowledge came from. They only cared that her solutions worked. And with every treatment she provided, she learned more about their fears, their dependencies, their desperation. By the time the first noble collapsed, the Lady of Poison already knew exactly how each ruler would react, which ones would panic, which ones would deny danger, and which ones would secretly blame their closest allies. What truly alarmed the court was how calm she remained in the face of turmoil. While nobles shouted accusations and demanded explanations, she simply watched them unravel, as though their fear was the reaction she had been waiting to measure. Some believed she had engineered the chaos to expose the fractures within the palace. Others suspected she sought to punish the monarchy for crimes buried in its past. But the truth was more intricate. Her mastery of toxins was only one side of her strategy. The other was psychological domination, achieved through the slow erosion of trust. As panic spread, she visited the private chambers of those who held the most influence, not to threaten them, but to observe how quickly their confidence fractured when confronted with the possibility of invisible danger. She never raised her voice, never made demands, never revealed motive. That silence was her most effective weapon. When someone speaks, they give others something to analyze. But silence forces the mind to fill in the blanks, to imagine horrors far worse than the truth. And the lady used that silence like a blade. By the end of the night, the court was no longer afraid of death itself. They were afraid of not knowing where death was hiding. That uncertainty is what allowed her to step further into the center of power, gaining an influence no monarch had ever granted willingly. And as she watched the palace struggle to regain composure, she understood that this was only the beginning of what she had come to accomplish, for her intentions reached deeper than the court could comprehend, pulling them into a darkness they had unknowingly invited. The first deaths were only the beginning. What terrified the royal court far more was the pattern that followed, a sequence so deliberate and precise that it became impossible to believe coincidence played any part in it. Hours after the initial collapse of the Duke and the others, more nobles began to suffer strange symptoms that none of the palace physicians could explain. Some lost their voices entirely, their throats tightening without warning. Others found their hands trembling uncontrollably, unable to hold a quill or lift a goblet. A few felt sudden waves of cold rushing through their bodies, as if their blood had turned against them. The court scribes recorded these episodes frantically, yet none of the descriptions matched any known illness. The only certainty was that the effects came and went like the shifting of the wind. Something invisible had infiltrated the palace, something that moved differently for each victim. Some nobles remained untouched, while others fell into episodes of near paralysis, only to recover minutes later. And yet, in the midst of this growing chaos, the Lady of Poison observed the unraveling with the calm precision of someone studying an experiment she had prepared in advance. What no one understood was that she had crafted her toxins not merely to kill, but to reveal. She wanted the truth of the court to rise to the surface, stripped of masks and diplomacy. And it worked. Under the threat of inexplicable death, alliances ruptured. Friends accused one another of treachery. Advisors whispered that the queen herself might be behind the events. The king suspected foreign spies. The princes turned on their tutors. The palace, once a place of opulent ceremony, had devolved into a nest of suspicion where every glance carried a threat. As fear spread, whispers of forbidden knowledge resurfaced. Some claimed the lady had learned to manipulate the nervous system using compounds lost since the age of ancient herbal sects. Others insisted she could control the onset of symptoms through something as subtle as her proximity or the tilt of her wrist. But no one dared approach her to ask. They watched from afar as she moved through the corridors like a calm storm, her mere presence causing silence to ripple across every chamber she entered. Physicians ordered the palace windows opened, believing fresh air might slow the mysterious affliction. Guards were instructed to avoid touching the walls for fear the poison lingered on surfaces. Servants fled the palace by night, carrying rumors into nearby towns that the royal family had angered a force they could not contain. And throughout all of it, the Lady of Poison remained unaccused, not because anyone trusted her, but because they feared the consequences of speaking her name. Yet the most disturbing moment occurred when a young princess collapsed during a council discussion. Her symptoms appeared and vanished within minutes, leaving no trace. The lady watched closely, her expression unreadable. Some believed they saw something like recognition flicker in her eyes, as though this reaction confirmed a hypothesis she had long anticipated. It raised a question that no one dared voice aloud. Was the lady selecting her victims based on political significance, or was she testing something deeper, something the court was only beginning to understand? By dawn, it had become clear that the court was no longer dealing with a mere poisoning. They were facing a calculated demonstration. And the Lady of Poison, calm and composed at the center of it all, seemed to know exactly how far this unraveling would spread before anyone could hope to stop it, pulling the entire palace deeper into a crisis it was never prepared to confront. What unfolded next revealed a side of the Lady of Poison that the court had never imagined, a side that was far more strategic than simply eliminating rivals. Hidden deep within the inner chambers of the palace was a small stone room reserved exclusively for ritual consultations, a place where only the most trusted advisors were permitted. Very few knew that she had been entering that chamber long before the poisonings began, carrying small pouches of powdered herbs and vials sealed with dark wax. Servants whispered that faint murmurs had been heard within, sounds too rhythmic to be mere conversation, too controlled to be accidental. When the court finally dared to investigate, they discovered faint traces on the stone floor, circular patterns drawn in substances that had since dried, symbols that none of the scholars could recognize. The air inside felt unusually cold, as though the room retained memories of something that had taken place there. The lady had used this chamber not as a sanctuary, but as a laboratory of influence, blending rare compounds with ritualistic precision. She understood that the court did not fear death itself. What they feared was the loss of control. And through these rituals, she learned exactly how to manipulate that fear. She often entered the chamber after moments of public tension, as though calibrating her next move. Some believed she used the space to test reactions on controlled samples. Others claimed she was communing with knowledge passed down from renegade herbal sects, merging biology with ancient psychological techniques. Witnesses reported seeing her emerge from the chamber with a stillness that bordered on unnatural, her expression focused, as if she carried inside her the answers to questions the court had not yet asked. What unsettled the monarchs most was that the symptoms appearing in the palace mirrored the sequence she had sketched onto the stone floor. First paralysis, then trembling, then breathlessness. It was as though the court was unknowingly participating in a ritual of her design, each noble playing a role they had not consented to, and the lady seemed to monitor their responses, with clinical interest, noting which kings resisted fear, which queens broke under pressure, which advisors attempted to manipulate the chaos for political gain. Late one night, a high-ranking officer reported seeing her place a thin strip of dark fabric across the ritual circle. What happened next he could not explain. The officer described feeling a strange wave of heat, followed by an immediate chill. His heart pounded violently. though he had not touched anything in the room. The lady simply looked at him and whispered something he could not recall later, as if the memory itself had been poisoned. He fled the chamber, convinced that the lady's knowledge extended beyond toxins into realms of influence the court was unprepared to face. By the next morning, the palace was gripped by a new kind of fear. Not only were they uncertain of what she had done, but now they feared what she could do next. Her rituals had become the invisible architecture behind the palace's collapse, shaping reactions before they happened, guiding panic into predictable patterns that she alone understood. And as nobles whispered in private, each wondered whether they had already become part of a ritual still unfolding, trapped within a design far larger than the poison that had first brought them to their knees. If this unraveling raises questions in your mind, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me what part of this hidden ritual chamber intrigues you the most. As your insight helps deepen the exploration of this dark chapter. What the court did not realize was that the Lady of Poison had already shifted her focus from isolated demonstrations to something far more devastating: the creation of toxins designed not merely to harm individuals, but to destabilize entire political structures without leaving a single trace. These were not ordinary poisons. They were compounds engineered to alter the balance of power itself, crafted with meticulous precision and an understanding of human nature that bordered on terrifying. She had spent years studying rare venoms that few even believed existed. Some were derived from insects found only in remote mountain passes. Others came from plants that bloomed for a single night before withering into dust. A few were whispered to originate from forgotten civilizations whose knowledge was buried under ruins. What unified these substances was their unpredictability. They could trigger subtle behavioral changes, heighten paranoia, distort perception, or magnify ambition. The lady understood that chaos did not always need a corpse. Sometimes it only needed a shift in temperament. Inside the palace, nobles began to experience unexplained impulses. A once calm advisor erupted in anger during a diplomatic meeting. A queen known for her composure grew suspicious of her closest ally. Princes who had never dared challenge authority suddenly demanded influence over military decisions. To outsiders, these changes seemed like normal political tension, but the lady watched them unfold with the detachment of someone observing an intricate game board. She knew which emotional fractures to widen, which insecurities to ignite, which fears to amplify with the slightest touch of her creations. The most disturbing aspect was that none of the afflicted could be certain whether their reactions were natural or induced. The court physicians found no discoloration, no fever, no detectable signs of poisoning. The lady had perfected the art of invisibility. Her toxins dissolved into the bloodstream, leaving no residue, no scent, no taste, turning the palace into a living test chamber where every emotion became suspect. And as the nobles questioned their own minds, she tightened her influence without ever raising her voice. Over time, factions that had once stood united fractured into rival camps. Advisors accused one another of betrayal. Long-standing alliances began to disintegrate under waves of mistrust. A few attempted to reorganize the court structure, believing stronger hierarchy would restore order. But each reorganization only deepened the instability, as if the palace itself were reacting to the presence of a force it could not contain. The lady strategically reinforced these fractures with carefully timed doses. She never targeted the same group twice. Instead, she created ripples across the social hierarchy, affecting those with vastly different roles and influence. Some toxins enhanced ambition, pushing individuals to overreach. Others weakened confidence, causing powerful nobles to retreat when strength was needed most. A few induced short-lived confusion, enough to disrupt negotiations or blur strategic decisions at crucial moments. What made her methods unstoppable was that the court could not identify a pattern. Every reaction seemed unique, tailored to the psychological profile of the victim. It was as though she had reached inside each person's private fears and used those vulnerabilities as conduits for her poisons. Political alliances faltered, military directives contradicted themselves, diplomatic correspondence grew erratic, and all the while, the Lady of Poison moved through the chaos with quiet precision, her goals known only to her. Yet even as the palace descended deeper into disorder, she appeared more focused than ever, studying the outcomes as though preparing for an even larger revelation, one that would extend far beyond the walls of the royal court. The turning point came during the grand royal banquet, a night meant to display unity at a time when the court was already cracking under the weight of unseen pressures. The palace staff had prepared the feast with meticulous care, unaware that the Lady of Poison had already woven her influence into the event long before the first torch was lit. The nobles entered the hall pretending everything was normal, masking fear behind jeweled garments and ceremonial smiles. But beneath the surface, every guest carried the quiet dread that someone among them would be the next to fall. The banquet began with strained laughter and hollow toasts. The musicians played, but their melodies felt strangely distant, as though the air was absorbing the sound rather than carrying it. The lady sat near the center of the room, not as a participant, but as an observer, her eyes scanning the crowd with the controlled detachment of someone evaluating the final stage of a carefully orchestrated plan. She did not need to act. She only needed to watch. As the first course was served, subtle changes began to unfold. A seasoned general suddenly forgot the name of the envoy seated beside him. A duchess, known for her eloquence, struggled to form coherent sentences. One noble found himself overwhelmed with an inexplicable surge of confidence, interrupting the king mid-speech to declare new military ambitions. Another noble, seated just across the table, grew pale and withdrew into silence, gripping the edges of her chair as though the room were spinning around her. Yet none of these symptoms resembled the dramatic collapses that had shaken the court earlier. This time, the effects were more refined, more precise, almost elegant in their subtlety. The lady had shifted her strategy from fear to manipulation, transforming the banquet into a silent battlefield where every gesture, every hesitation, every surge of emotion revealed the influence of her invisible toxins. The palace. Healers hovered anxiously at the edges of the hall, sensing something was wrong, but unable to diagnose anything concrete. As the evening progressed, the instability in the room grew more pronounced. Two nobles erupted into an argument over a dispute that had been resolved years earlier. A young prince accused his mentor of betrayal, his voice trembling with conviction, even though he offered no evidence. Several guests reported feeling sudden warmth, followed by chills that crept along their arms like whispers. A few became unusually talkative, revealing private fears that should never have been spoken aloud. The toxins did not attack their bodies. They attacked their restraint. Through it all, the lady remained calm. She lifted her goblet only once, not to drink, but to observe how many watched her movements with dread. It was clear that she had gained the court's undivided attention, even as they pretended to ignore her. What none of them realized was that the banquet itself had been designed to expose the depth of their vulnerabilities. By placing them all in one room, she allowed their fears, ambitions, and suspicions to collide without her needing to lift a finger. Each outburst, each fracture, each shift in behavior confirmed what she already knew. The court was collapsing from within. By the end of the night, the king himself appeared shaken. His voice wavered during the final toast, and his gaze drifted repeatedly toward the Lady of Poison, as though he sensed that she alone understood what was happening. When the nobles departed, they did so in tense silence, some avoiding eye contact, others walking faster than usual, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere that had taken hold of the hall. But the lady did not leave. She lingered at the long table, observing the aftermath, studying the patterns of disruption she had triggered. The banquet had not been an act of destruction, it had been a revelation. And the court, without realizing it, had shown her exactly how much further she could push them before the entire structure crumbled under the weight of its own hidden fractures. What followed the banquet was not chaos, but submission. The kind of quiet surrender that occurs when people realize resistance might cost them more than obedience. The Lady of Poison did not need to threaten anyone directly. Her influence had already spread through the palace like a second atmosphere, invisible yet unavoidable. Kings who once commanded, armies now watched her movements with the caution of prey. Queens who had shaped diplomacy for decades found themselves reconsidering every word spoken in her presence. It was as if the entire court had entered into an unspoken pact governed by rules only she understood. The shift began subtly. Advisors stopped holding private meetings without first ensuring she was nowhere nearby. Generals delayed decisions, insisting they needed further clarity, though everyone knew clarity had nothing to do with it. Even the royal scribes hesitated before recording decrees, uncertain whether the lady might interpret a single phrase as defiance. Fear had become the court's new protocol, shaping actions before thoughts could fully form. What made her control so absolute was the absence of any explicit demand. She did not seize the throne, rewrite laws, or issue proclamations. Instead, she created a climate in which the court governed itself according to imagined boundaries, each noble believing they understood what the lady expected, though none had ever heard her articulate a single command. This uncertainty made her power limitless. When people fear punishment but do not know its terms, they invent restrictions far harsher than any tyrant could impose. The first sign that she had solidified her dominance came when a foreign ambassador requested an audience with the king. Instead of greeting him, the monarch directed him to speak with the lady, a gesture unthinkable weeks earlier. The ambassador complied, bowing before her as though she already held an official title. Word of this moment spread rapidly, reinforcing the belief that she had become the court's true authority, even if no one dared label her as such. Behind closed doors, monarchs argued over how to regain control, but their debates dissolved into fear-fueled speculation. Could she poison an entire council meeting with a single breath? Could she influence a kingdom's future simply by choosing who to stand near during a ceremony? Could she destabilize another realm with the same precision she had used here? The possibility of her power extending beyond their borders terrified them more than the deaths that had already occurred. Yet the lady continued her work without theatrics. She moved through the palace with quiet certainty, observing how her presence altered behaviors. Nobles bowed lower, guards stepped aside quicker, servants whispered more softly, as though the air itself might carry their words back to her. Every interaction confirmed what she had already understood. Fear is not a weapon one wields. It is a climate one cultivates. The most revealing moment came when she approached the royal council chamber one evening. The guards, without instruction, opened the doors before she even reached them. Inside, the entire council rose to their feet, not out of respect, but out of necessity. An instinctive recognition that she had become the axis around which their world now turned. She walked among them slowly, saying nothing, yet every heartbeat in the room aligned to her pace. And then, without warning, she left, offering no explanation, no command, no gesture. The council waited in silence long after she had gone, uncertain whether her departure meant safety, danger, or something neither category could contain. That ambiguity was her true mastery. She controlled the court not by force, but by shaping the fear of what she might choose to do next. If this growing, psychological grip over the royal court stirs any thoughts in you, share your impressions in the comments, and tell me which moment of her silent domination struck you the most. The consequences of the Lady of Poison's silent dominion soon extended beyond the throne room and seeped into the very bloodlines of the noble families. What had begun as subtle disruption evolved into a slow, spiraling collapse of dynasties that had stood unshaken for generations. The court no longer feared her toxins alone. They feared what she could awaken inside the minds of those exposed to her influence. This fear rippled outward, moving from the elders of the realm to their heirs, destabilizing the next generation before it had a chance to inherit anything at all. Families that once prided themselves on unity found themselves fractured. Siblings argued over imagined slights, each convinced the other might be secretly aligned with the lady. Fathers doubted their sons. Mothers whispered warnings to daughters who had done nothing wrong. No one could tell whether their emotional shifts were natural reactions to stress or subtle aftereffects of the poisons she had released into the palace air. The uncertainty itself became a toxin, dissolving trust more effectively than any venom in her possession. As these fractures widened, letters carried by messengers revealed that the chaos had begun spreading to neighboring courts. Alliances forged through marriages and treaties showed signs of strain. A distant kingdom accused the royal family of harboring a dangerous infiltrator. Another withdrew its ambassadors altogether, believing the palace was cursed. Rumors circulated that the Lady of Poison had developed compounds capable of traveling unseen through fabrics, plants, or even breath. Whether these claims were true did not matter. The mere possibility was enough to fracture international stability. Inside the palace, nobles attempted to counter her influence through elaborate precautions. They wore gloves to avoid accidental contact, refused to share meals, and demanded that every room be inspected before entering. But the court soon realized that physical defenses meant nothing against an adversary who operated through psychology as much as chemistry. The lady did not need to lay a hand on anyone, she merely needed them to believe she could. And once that belief took root, the palace became its own instrument of destruction. One particularly devastating effect emerged when several nobles began experiencing vivid hallucinations during tense discussions. Some heard echoes of conversations that had never taken place. Others claimed to see shadows moving behind them even in empty corridors. A few believed they were being followed by the lady herself, only to turn and find no one there. Physicians searched for natural explanations, but the symptoms fluctuated unpredictably, suggesting a catalyst beyond their understanding. Whether these visions were real, toxins, or manifestations of fear, the outcome was the same. The palace no longer trusted its senses. Political repercussions arrived swiftly. Lands governed by the affected families fell into disarray. Taxes went uncollected, borders unprotected, and trade routes disrupted. The nobles who tried to maintain order found themselves increasingly isolated, unable to depend on allies who suspected betrayal at every turn. Even the royal guard fractured, dividing itself into factions that defended different interpretations of the lady's intentions. Through all of this, she remained composed, her presence stable in contrast to the unraveling world around her. She observed the noble's downward spiral with the calm attentiveness of someone reading a record of events she had already foreseen. It became evident that her power had evolved beyond the physical realm of toxins. She had created an emotional and political contagion, a self-perpetuating collapse that no antidote could reverse. And, as the families that once shaped the destiny of kingdoms fell into turmoil, the Lady of Poison stood at the edge of their destruction, poised to reveal the next stage of her design, a stage that would strike at the final layer of resistance the court still believed it possessed. As the court's internal fractures deepened, the nobles finally attempted the one thing they had feared from the beginning: capturing the Lady of Poison. It was a decision born not of confidence, but of desperation, a last effort by rulers who felt their kingdoms slipping out of their hands. The royal guard assembled in secret, each soldier sworn to silence, each believing they might not return alive. They prepared antidotes, protective charms, and elaborate containment devices designed by the palace alchemists. None of them realized that every step they took had already been anticipated. The guards approached her private quarters at dawn, hoping to catch her unprepared. Yet when they entered the corridor, they found it empty and unnaturally quiet, as if the palace itself were holding its breath. The air smelled faintly of crushed herbs, hints of bitter plants and resinous smoke. Some guards hesitated, unsure whether they were sensing danger or their own fear amplifying the moment. Still, they pressed forward, determined to reclaim the control they had already lost. When they pushed open her door, they found her seated calmly at a small wooden table, grinding a mixture of powders with slow, deliberate movements. She did not flinch when they entered. She did not reach for a weapon or stand in defense. Instead, she continued her work, acknowledging them only with a faint glance that held neither surprise nor concern. For a moment, the guards were unsure whether to advance. Something about her composure unsettled them more deeply than any threat could have. One of the commanders stepped forward, attempting to immobilize her with restraints treated to neutralize toxins. But as he approached, his knees weakened, and he stumbled backward, gasping for breath. His companions rushed to his aid, only to find themselves struck with sudden dizziness, their vision blurring at the edges. Some tried to retreat, but their bodies responded sluggishly, as though the air itself had thickened around them. And still, the lady remained seated, not lifting a finger. What they did not know was that she had prepared the room as meticulously as she had prepared the court. The walls were dusted with compounds invisible to the naked eye, activated only when the temperature shifted at sunrise. The floorboards released faint vapors when pressure was applied. Even the dried flowers hanging from the ceiling served a purpose, releasing subtle extracts when disturbed by the soldiers' movements. Each reaction was mild enough to avoid immediate collapse, but potent enough to disrupt coordination and break their resolve. Several guards panicked, believing they were on the verge of death. Others tried to resist the effects, but found their limbs heavy, their thoughts muddled, their instincts unreliable. They could neither advance nor retreat without stumbling. The lady finally stood, her presence commanding the space without effort. She approached the nearest soldier, who flinched as though touched by fire, even though she did not raise her hand. The fear alone was enough to immobilize him. Instead of punishment, she merely observed them, studying their reactions with clinical focus. She seemed less interested in stopping the attack and more interested in understanding how far her influence had reached. She watched their trembling hands, their uneven breathing, their fractured courage. It was a demonstration not of her toxins, but of her mastery over their minds. The guards realized too late that capturing her had never been possible. The palace itself had become part of her defense. By the time the effects subsided, she had vanished. No one saw her leave. No doors had been opened, no windows broken. Some claimed she had slipped into hidden passages beneath the palace. Others believed she walked through the courtyard in plain sight, unnoticed by those paralyzed by fear. Whatever the truth, one fact became undeniable. The court had lost its final chance to regain control. And the Lady of Poison had stepped into the shadows, preparing the last movement of a design that would alter the fate of every kingdom touched by her presence. When the Lady of Poison disappeared into the unseen corridors of the palace, the court believed the worst had already passed. But what came afterward revealed that her true power had never been the toxins she crafted, nor the fear she inspired, nor even the political fractures she exploited. Her greatest weapon was the silence she left behind, the uncertainty that lingered in every chamber, the lingering suspicion that she might return at any moment, unseen and unstoppable. And it was this lingering presence, more than any physical act, that shaped the final episode of her influence. Days after her escape, the palace became unrecognizable. The nobles gathered in tight clusters, whispering theories that shifted by the hour. Some believed she had retreated to the outer forests to prepare a final strike. Others insisted she remained inside the palace walls, hidden in forgotten tunnels, watching them from the shadows. Even the king, once unshakable in his authority, paced the halls at night, convinced that she had poisoned the future of his lineage, not just his court. Then came the night when the torches dimmed on their own. No wind, no servants passing by. The flames simply weakened, as though the air had thinned. A dense stillness fell across the palace. Guards froze. Doors creaked without being touched. A faint scent drifted through the corridors, something floral yet bitter, familiar yet unplaceable. Instantly, every noble remembered the banquet, the rituals, the deaths, the tremors. Panic spread faster than footsteps. But the lady did not appear. Instead, what emerged was a message, not spoken aloud, not written on any parchment, but understood by every person who felt the atmosphere tighten around them. They realized that she had achieved what no conquest, no uprising, no invasion had ever managed. She had reshaped the identity of the royal court. Their hierarchy, their confidence, their alliances, even their understanding of power itself had been permanently altered. They were no longer governed by tradition or lineage. They were governed by the memory of her. The next morning, several nobles abandoned their posts. Others locked themselves in their chambers. Messengers fled before delivering their letters. And in the council chamber, the king declared a new decree, one that attempted to erase her existence from official record. Her name, her role, her deeds, all forbidden from being spoken. Yet this silence only strengthened her legacy. What is forbidden becomes unforgettable. Scholars in later generations would find stray notes suggesting that she had left behind more than fear. Hidden in the ritual chamber were faint traces of formulas no one could fully decipher, clues pointing to a theory that unnerved even the most rational minds. She had not simply weaponized toxins, but had begun exploring compounds capable of altering the body's responses for years, perhaps even across generations. Whether true or imagined, the idea alone ensured that every child born into the noble families grew up under the shadow of her name. As the court struggled to rebuild order, one truth settled over the palace like dust. The Lady of Poison had not been defeated. She had simply stepped beyond their reach, leaving them to confront the consequences of their own unraveling. And with each passing year, whispered accounts of her resurfaced. A sighting in a distant kingdom, a sudden, unexplained death at a banquet, a monarch who fell ill after dismissing warnings. Whether myth or reality, her presence lingered like an unseen toxin, shaping decisions long after her departure. If you reached this far, tell me your thoughts in the comments and share the phrase "I am with you until the end," so I know you followed this entire descent through her forbidden legacy. And if this journey through the shadows of power resonated with you, consider subscribing so we can explore more stories that reveal the hidden engines behind history. A simple like also helps strengthen this space where we uncover what rulers tried to conceal. And if you want to continue this exploration, there is another story waiting right beside this one. Feel free to step into it whenever you are ready.